Tuesday, May 10th, 1994, Statesville Correctional Facility, Illinois. A 52-year-old man is strapped to a gurney in the execution chamber and has cannula inserted into both of his arms. In life and imminent death, this man was one of the most reviled serial killers in US and even world history, becoming almost synonymous with the term. A man who had murdered at least 33 young men and boys over a 6-year period. To this day, 6 of his victims remain unidentified. All the while, outwardly styling himself as a pillar of the local community. As the curtain is pulled aside and the condemned man is revealed to the waiting witnesses, he offers his last words of resigned defiance. "Kiss my ass." When the appointed hour struck, the buttons are pressed on the injection pump, and the lethal cocktail of drugs begins to flow into his system. Death follows a few minutes later, putting an end to a truly vile and sadistic creature. Today, Descent into Darkness examines the life and crimes of John Wayne Gacy, the killer clown. Early years. John Wayne Gacy was born on the 17th of March 1942 in Chicago, Illinois. He was the middle child of 3 to John and Marion, both of his siblings being sisters. John Sr. was a mechanic and a veteran of the First World War, whilst Marion was a traditional homemaker, and the family had both Danish and Polish ancestry. Seemingly, John had something of a yin and yang childhood, tending to prefer the company of his mom and sisters, as his father was an alcoholic who regularly violently abused and belittled his family. Due to John Jr. frequently hanging out with his sisters, his father would regularly accuse him of being a sissy and a mama's boy, even telling him that he will, quote, "probably grow up queer." Certainly not an environment conducive producing a well-adjusted child. At some point in 1949, John Jr. and another boy were caught whilst attempting to sexually molest a girl. When his father heard about this, he beat his son mercilessly. John Sr.'s disgracefully worded prophecy on his son's sexuality would soon come to pass, though, although he would remain in the proverbial closet about it, most likely ashamed due to the impact of his dad's scornful words. Nevertheless, despite everything, young Gacy still loved his old man, but always felt that whatever he did just was never quite enough to impress him or make him proud. All of these troubling issues clearly compounding to what was to come. As he grew, Gacy became quite overweight and suffered from a heart condition that occasionally caused him to have blackouts. This led to his doctor advising him to avoid sports or any other high-intensity cardiovascular exercise. His father regularly accused him of being lazy and a malingerer. He would be hospitalized in 1957 from a burst appendix, which, if left untreated, could have killed him. His troubled home life is most likely what led to Gacy failing high school, but this would not be the end of his scholastic efforts. When he turned 18, Gacy entered the world of politics, taking a job as an assistant precinct captain for the Democratic Party. Finally, his father showed him a modicum of kindness by buying him a car, although young John would have to pay him back for the purchase. At least it was a helpful leg up to his working life. But of course, old habits die hard, and his dad held the debt over his son and threatened to confiscate the keys if he failed to keep up with the payments or disobeyed him. This became a back-and-forth argument, eventually leading to John Sr. removing the distributor cap for the vehicle, rendering it inoperable. He kept it for 3 days, but as soon as he had given it back, young Gacy decided to flee to Nevada. He had only $136 in his pocket as he headed off for Las Vegas, arranging to stay with a cousin. He had finally escaped the overbearing, tyrannical rule of his old man, and gaining the freedom that he so desperately needed. Initially, he worked as an ambulance driver before getting a job assisting in a mortuary. Here, as one would expect, he was exposed to the dead and took part in the embalming process. This would show another dark side to his psyche, as by this point he was sleeping at the morgue in a small room next to the embalming room. One night, he decided to climb into the coffin alongside a corpse of a man. He huddled up close to the man's body and held it for a while, before he was overcome by a sense of shock. It shocked him to the point where he decided to leave Las Vegas and return home. Not long after the return of the prodigal son, Gacy decided to enroll himself at the Northwestern Business College in New Lawn, Illinois. He did very well here, certainly a much better time than he had at high school, graduating in 1963. When he earned his diploma, he took up a trainee manager job at a shoe company called Nunn Bush. After a while, and clearly doing well, he was sent over to their branch in Springfield, working his way up the ranks from salesman to department manager, after later joining his local chapter of the Junior Chamber, a civic society, also known as the Jaycees. Then, in the March of 1964, he began a relationship with one of his co-workers named Marilyn Myers. Although not long after this had begun, he had a homosexual experience. Allegedly, another member of the Jaycees had gotten him drunk and then gave him a Hummer whilst he was insensible on the sofa. Despite this, Gacy and Myers would be married that very September. He continued to do well in his career and had risen to the lofty heights of vice president of the Junior Chamber. The next big event in Gacy's life would come with a move to Waterloo, Iowa. Marilyn's old man, clearly not short of a buck or two, had bought 3 Kentucky Fried Chicken outlets, becoming one of their franchisees, and he had just the job for his business-savvy son-in-law, putting him in to oversee all 3 restaurants. This job also came with a free house, as the young couple were allowed to move into the old Myers home. For this new role, he would be paid a handsome salary of $15,000 a year, around $154,000 in today's dollar bills, y'all. On top of this, he would also get a cut of the profits. That's not a bad screw if you can get it. Gacy was a very hands-on manager who ingratiated himself with his employees, even building a rec room in his basement with a pool table and bar where he would invite the boys over to chill, shoot some pool, and the breeze. This made him perhaps one of the best bosses ever, if you don't count all the murder and stuff. Children would soon follow for the young Gacy family, as in February of 1966 and March the following year, Marilyn gave birth to a boy and a girl respectively. Even greater things would come for Gacy personally, as his hard work and dedication finally earned his father's respect that he so craved for, at last apologizing for his ways and admitting that he was wrong about his son all along. This period of time would be fondly remembered by Gacy as the best in his life thus far. He had made it. When he moved to Iowa, he kept on with the Junior Chamber, which he dedicated more and more time to, despite his heavy schedule with the restaurants. But it did mean that the Gacy events would be regularly supplied with fried chicken, much to everyone's delight. He would become appointed to the board of directors of the Waterloo Jaycees chapter, but beneath the surface of the successful chicken slinger, there lurked a slumbering beast that was about to wake up. The assault of Ronald Voorhees and first imprisonment. John Wayne Gacy's first experience of the long arm of the law came in the March of 1968 from an incident in the previous August. He had invited a 15-year-old Ronald Voorhees around to his house with the promise of watching some adult films that were regularly shown at Jaycee parties. He had then plied the young teen with drink until he was quite intoxicated. Gacy then suggested mutual oral sex, telling Ronald, quote, "You have to have sex with a man before you start having sex with women." In his drunken state, Voorhees wasn't in much of a state to refuse. Skipping to the following March, Voorhees had plucked up the courage to tell his father about the incident. His father did the right thing and immediately informed the police, who arrested Gacy for sexual assault on a minor. In the meantime, however, Gacy had been sexually assaulting other youths in the local area, using various deceptions to get what he wanted, including blackmail and even at one point the pretense of conducting research into homosexuality. Once Gacy was arrested for the abuse of Ronald Voorhees, another charge was added when Edward Lynch came forward, who also alleged sexual assault. Gacy was very vocal in his denial of the allegations, although his hubris would backfire when he demanded a polygraph test, which he failed. He also blamed the source of the allegations on Voorhees' father, a fellow Jaycee who had objected to Gacy's appointment as president of the chapter. These spurious attempts to allay suspicion didn't work, and Gacy was indicted, but bailed pending trial. Gacy would further compound the deep caca that he was in by paying an employee named Russell Schroeder to beat up the younger Voorhees to prevent him from testifying. Schroeder did as he was told, but he was arrested, and after a while confessed that Gacy had put him up to it. So now he would have to face further charges of witness intimidation and conspiracy. For his upcoming trial, Gacy underwent a psychological evaluation which reported back that he was showing signs of psychopathy and/or personality disorder, but crucially the report did state that he was mentally fit to stand trial. When his trial began on the 7th of November, he pleaded guilty to sexual assault on Ronald Voorhees, but denied any other charges. Despite this, he still attempted to diminish his blame by claiming Voorhees had propositioned him. Thankfully, the jury didn't buy his excuses, and he was sentenced to 10 years. On the same day that his sentence was passed, his wife Marilyn filed for divorce, which was quickly granted only a couple of weeks later. She was awarded custody of the 2 children and the family home. Gacy would have to pay alimony, and he would never see any of them for the rest of his days. You would think that a man like Gacy would have suffered in prison, but quite the opposite. He seemed to thrive in the Anamosa State Penitentiary, using his savvy business and negotiation skills to argue for higher pay for the inmates' labour, and rose to the head of cook in the prison kitchens. There would also be a prison chapter of the junior chamber, which he straightaway joined, convincing many others to do so, greatly increasing its membership. During his time on the inside, he was famously filmed for a news segment about prison rehabilitation, for which he was seen as a model prisoner who did his best to improve the lot of his fellow inmates. Despite his 10-year sentence, Gacy's perceived selflessness whilst he was locked up led him to applying for early parole. His first attempt in June 1969 was denied. Therefore, he endeavoured to really impress the parole board and showcase his rehabilitation by undertaking 16 educational courses to earn his GED, which he earned very quickly, being awarded his diploma in November of the same year. But tragedy would strike the Gacy family when, on Christmas Day of '69, John was informed that his father had died of cirrhosis of the liver. Despite the awful treatment he had received during his childhood, Gacy was completely devastated, weeping for hours on end. This was further added to when the prison governor denied his request to attend the funeral. Release and repeat offending. Thanks to his good behaviour, freedom would come for Gacy in June 1970, only a year and a half into his sentence. He was ordered to undergo 1 year of probation as a condition of his release, which included a curfew and moving back to his mom's house. And so Gacy moved back to Chicago. He seemed to hit the ground running, quickly getting himself a job as a cook. But he clearly couldn't help himself, as only 8 months later, in February 1971, he would be charged with sexually assaulting another young boy near the Chicago bus station. Unfortunately for fate, the boy failed to show in court, forcing the judge to dismiss the case. But then, the following June, he would once again be charged with the same offence on someone else. However, once again, the devil came to his aid when the court learned that the boy had tried to blackmail Gacy, and so once again the case was dismissed. Only a month later, Gacy was off probation, who, astoundingly, were not made aware of the alleged incidents. Now not being bound to live with his mom, Gacy, along with some financial help from his old lady, was able to buy himself a house on West Somerdale Avenue at number 8213. It would be this address, along with John himself, that would enter the annals of infamy. But before all that would go down, Gacy would find love again after being reunited with an old childhood sweetheart named Carol Hoff in the August of 1971. The couple became engaged soon after. One must wonder if she was aware of his prior conviction. Less than a year later, on the 1st of July 1972, John and Carol were married. All seemed to be going well from here on, but out of the blue in early 1975, John confided to his wife that he was bisexual, and then, not long after, told her that he would not have sex with her ever again. He then became incredibly distant from his wife, who then noticed that he was bringing young men back to the house and going into the garage with them, until the wee small hours of the morning. Toward the end of the same year, Carol decided to look further into what was going on in the garage and found a stack of gay pornography and a small stash of possessions that clearly did not belong to him. When she confronted John about all this, he flew into a rage. The couple argued for quite a while until Carol decided that she had had enough. She filed for divorce in October. Gacy decided not to contest the divorce and even agreed to let Carol continue to live in the house until she was able to find somewhere else, which she did in the following February. Carol agreed to stating the reason for the divorce was infidelity with other women, possibly to protect his reputation, not that that was exactly stellar, as we know. Following his divorce, Gacy began increasing his homosexual encounters with young men, regularly going out in the car to pick someone up, known in the gay community as cruising. His neighbours would later remark that they often saw various comings and goings from the Gacy's house, one of them even reporting that their son would regularly be awoken by various screams, shouts and crying sounds coming from the house. Self-employment, further crimes, politics, and Pogo the Clown. Not long after his release from prison, Gacy decided to start a part-time construction business called Painting, Decorating and Maintenance Contractors, or PDM for short. His probation officer approved of the idea, no doubt seeing it as a healthy way towards his rehabilitation. Being your own boss is the American dream, after all. He balanced his commitments towards his current job as a cook and with the new venture, and quickly began making a success of himself, even to the point in mid-1973 where he was able to leave the cook's job and focus solely on his new business. By 1978, Gacy's hard work was definitely paying off, with a good number of employees under him, and even taking on a further job as a supervisor for a shop remodeling company called PE Systems. He was absolutely coining it in, with PDM bringing in $200,000 that year. His standing within the local community was very high, despite his previous history and marital troubles, becoming involved in many local groups and community ventures. It would be one of these groups that led him to his next little side hustle. He became a member of the Jolly Joker Clown Club that put on fundraisers and visited children's wards in hospitals to cheer them up. Of course, nowadays, clowns are absolutely bloody terrifying, not helped in hindsight by Gacy becoming one of them, but times were simpler back then. Gacy decided to join them in 1975, creating his own clown personality named Pogo. By all accounts, Pogo was very well received, but what is not so widely known is that he had a second clown persona called Patches, who was much more serious and darker than Pogo. I do hope that the kids only met Pogo. It would be this facet of his personality that would later earn him the gruesome moniker of the Killer Clown when the truth of his crimes became known. Gacy re-entered the world of politics sometime after he had established PDM, offering his employees to clean the local Democratic Party HQ free of charge as a way to ingratiate himself. He continued to beaver away in local politics and became quite well known. In 1975, the Chicago Polish Constitution Day Parade named him as their director, a role he would fulfill until his capture. On the 6th of May 1978, he even met the First Lady, Rosalind Carter, being photographed with her and earning a special pin badge which granted him, quote, special clearance, whatever that means. Bear in mind that this event occurred a whole 6 years after Gacy had committed his first murder, but more on that side of things later. However, Gacy's ways were far from changed. He made a point of employing young men and teens. Outwardly, this would be seen as a good thing, providing jobs for the younger generation, but of course he had a much more insidious motive for doing so, often propositioning them for sex. If they refused, he would make thinly veiled threats, telling them that he had guns and that it would be so easy to get rid of a body. At one point in 1973, during one of Gacy's many business trips, this time to Florida, he took one of his teenage employees with him, and then raped the boy in the hotel room that they were staying in. The employee then waited until they were back in Chicago before confronting Gacy and assaulting him. When Carol asked him why he had been attacked, Gacy made up an excuse about the boy being angry because he had refused to pay him because his work was not up to standard. One occasion where Gacy met his match was when he attempted to restrain a boy called Antonio Antonucci. Little did Gacy know that Antonio was an accomplished wrestler at his high school. Gacy had tried to handcuff him after he had gotten him drunk, but Antonio, despite already having an injury to his foot, managed to get free and then grappled with his would-be captor and managed to turn the tables, cuffing Gacy with his hands behind his back. Eventually, Gacy calmed down and agreed to leave if Antonio unlocked the cuffs. Strangely, Antonio carried on working for Gacy for a further 9 months. Another incident occurred on the 26th of January 1976 when Gacy picked up 18-year-old hitchhiker named David Cram. The two got talking during the journey, and Gacy used the opportunity to offer the young man a job with PDM, and even offered him a place to stay in his spare room. Cram, believing the best intentions, readily agreed. On the evening of August 22nd, it was Cram's birthday. He and Gacy drank in celebration, but all did not end joyously. On that evening, Gacy had decided to get dressed up in his Pogo the Clown garb and began performing a few tricks for the birthday boy. But then the real purpose for this weirdness became known, as Gacy managed to convince Cram to be handcuffed, in the name of an impending trick. His hands were pinioned to his front. Then, Gacy suddenly span him around and told Cram that he was going to rape him. Cram snapped out of his drunken reverie and managed to effectively resist, kicking Gacy in the face and getting himself away. Still, though, Cram stayed at the house, perhaps thinking that it was all just pissed-up hijinks gone wrong. But then, a month later, Gacy decided to try again, standing in the doorway of Cram's room and saying once again that he was going to rape him. He even threatened him to not resist by saying, "Dave, you really don't know who I am. Maybe it would be good if you give me what I want." Naturally, Cram still did resist and managed to fight Gacy off, eventually giving up and leaving the room, saying, "You ain't no fun." This was the final straw for David Cram. He moved out the very next day, quite possibly inadvertently saving his own life. Gacy would take in one more younger lodger into the house between 76 and 77 by the name of Michael Rossi. I have been unable to find out if anything untoward ever happened between them, but then perhaps Rossi was that way inclined. They were seen together in public, both dressed as clowns at community events. The murders. As has become the tradition of this channel, I have scoured around to find as much information as possible on the victims and their final movements, to tell their stories and remind everyone that they were in fact real people, not just a number. January 3rd, 1972. Timothy Jack McCoy, age 16. Tim McCoy spent his early years growing up in both Iowa and Nebraska. He had gone traveling and was returning home when he was picked up by Gacy. McCoy was on his way to his dad's house in Omaha, Nebraska, and had stopped for a layover in Chicago at the Greyhound bus station when he had met the man who would seal his fate. Gacy had gained McCoy's trust by offering him a little sightseeing tour of Chicago and then lured him back to the house. Once there, Gacy claimed that McCoy had tried to attack him first, but I find that very dubious. What is clear is that there was a struggle and a fight before Gacy got him onto the floor, before producing a kitchen knife and repeatedly stabbing him in the chest. Gacy remarked that whilst he watched McCoy die and listened to his agonal breaths, he experienced a shattering orgasm. It was from this point that he knew that the act of killing was his ultimate thrill. When police finally investigated Gacy's house, a very large dried bloodstain was found underneath the carpet in the bedroom. Tim McCoy was identified through his dental records. Circa January 1972 to July 1975. Unidentified victim, number 28. July 31st, 1975. John Butkovich, 18. A dropout from Lane Tech, John Butkovich had been working for Gacy for around 8 months and had left his family home and gone round to ask for his final paycheck. It would be the last time that he was seen alive. When Butkovich's dad had contacted Gacy and asked him what he knew, Gacy had said that he would be happy to assist in the search for the lad. The worried parents smelled a rat and badgered the police over 100 times to urge them to look further into Gacy, but these were ignored. John's body would become the very first to be discovered by crime scene investigators. Circa November 1976 to March 1977. Francis Wayne Alexander, aged either 21 or 22. Preferring to be known as Wayne, he was raised in North Carolina and had spent some time in New York. By February 1975, Wayne had moved to Chicago and was married soon after. However, the marriage did not last long, and divorce was filed for a few months later. His family assumed that, as no one had heard anything for a while, that he just wanted to be left alone. Crucially, this assumption led them to not file a missing persons report with the police. April 6, 1976. Darrell Sampson, aged 19. Sadly, not much is known about Darrell Sampson's early years or his disappearance. March 13, 1976. Samuel Stapleton, aged 14. The young Samuel was walking his way home from his sister's house in Chicago on the day he went missing. A bracelet he was wearing at the time was discovered near one of the bodies found in Gacy's basement. He was later positively identified via dental records. Samuel Stapleton would become one of 2 of Gacy's youngest victims. May 14th, 1976. Randall Reffett, aged 15. Sadly, not much of anything is known of Randall's final movements before his disappearance, other than earlier that day he had been at a dentist appointment. He would be identified via an X-ray which showed the remnants of a previous unrelated stab wound that was treated at Vice Memorial Hospital. June 3rd, 1976. Michael Bonin, age 17. Gacy picked up Michael Bonin as he was travelling from Chicago to Waukegan. A clue to Michael Bonin's disappearance at the hands of Gacy was found in his house when investigators found Bonin's fishing license. June 13th, 1976. William Carroll, age 16. A bit of a tearaway, William Carroll had a habit of getting himself into trouble with the law. The day of his disappearance happened to be his brother's birthday. He had promised his father that he would be back home in an hour. He was last seen alive getting into the back of a dark-coloured car, along with 3 other teenage boys. Circa June to August 1976. Unidentified victim, number 26, aged between 22 or 30. His height is estimated to be between 5'2" and 5'6". August 5th, 1976. Jimmy Harkinson, aged 16. A native of the Minnesota state capital, St. Paul, Jimmy had called his mother on the very day of his disappearance to tell her that he had arrived safely in Chicago. This would be the last anyone ever heard from him. There is every chance that this phone call could have been made from Gacy's house. He would not be identified until 40 years after the fateful day via DNA samples supplied by his brother and sister. Circa August to October 1976. Unidentified victim number 13, aged between 17 and 21. Estimated height 5'11" to 6'2". Circa August to October 1976. Unidentified victim number 21, aged between 21 and 27. Approximate height 5'8" to 6 foot. August 6th, 1976. Rick Johnson, aged 17. Rick Johnston was last seen alive by his mother as she dropped him off at the Aragon Ballroom to attend a concert. Circa October 76. William George Bundy, aged 19. William was quite the high school athlete, excelling at both diving and gymnastics. On the day of his disappearance, his parents noticed that he accidentally left his wallet behind when he had left the house to head out to a party. His whereabouts would remain unknown for 30 years. His fate would be confirmed thanks to the tenacity of the Cook County Sheriff, Tom Dart, who would finally link one of the bodies in Gacy's crawlspace to the 19-year-old Bundy with DNA samples from his siblings. Some have speculated that Williams was working for Gacy, but this has never been substantiated. August 24th, 1976. Michael Marino, aged 14, disputed, and Kenneth Parker, aged 16. Tragically, this date would see 2 young lives cut short. Longtime friends Michael and Kenneth were last seen at the intersection of Clark Street and Diversey Drive. This crossroads was a regular haunt for Gacy, who picked up a few of his victims from this point. It would seem that October 24th, 1976 was one of those days. Both bodies were buried in the same shallow grave dug by Gacy in the crawlspace. However, Michael's mother Sherry has claimed that the remains found were not of her son. Investigators had told her that the dental records matched, but after 1.5 years of waiting. But she remains resolute that it is not her son. She remarked of the times when she would visit the supposed grave of her son after a proper burial. "I would touch the grave and I felt nothing, and I'd constantly talk to it. Michael, if this is you, please give me a sign. There was always nothing. Just completely cold." She cited a time that she was with him at the dentist when he had a tooth pulled, but the dental findings on the body do not show any teeth missing. Certainly the clothing found on the body did not match the clothes that Michael was last seen wearing. His body was exhumed in 2015 for DNA testing, which backs up her assertion. This, of course, leads to the question of what did happen to her son, and who was this body. This means that it is likely the body buried next to Kenneth Parker was not that of Michael Marino. December 11th, 1976. Gregory Godzik, aged 17. A senior from Taft who had been working for Gacy for only 3 weeks, Gregory's abandoned car was found by his friends. He had left the house at 2000 hours to visit his girlfriend, but had never arrived. His family hired a private investigator to try and locate him, but the trail ran cold. During his confession, Gacy claimed that he forced Gregory to dig his own grave. He also told Godchik's parents that he had received messages on his answering machine from Gregory saying that he wanted to run away from home. However, when his parents asked to hear the recording, Gacy rather conveniently said that he had deleted the message. January 20th, 1977. John Sick, aged 19. John Sick is another whose prior movements are unknown. However, investigators found a ring from Maine West High School. Gacy claimed to have lured Sick into the house with a generous offer to buy his car from him, a Plymouth Satellite. A while after he was murdered, Gacy had the goal to sell this car to Michael Rossi for $300. Rossi would later be caught attempting to steal gasoline, but the police never bothered to look any further into Gacy, who had told him that Sick had sold him the car. A body was later matched to him via dental records. March 15th, 1977. John Prestige, aged 20. Hailing from Kalamazoo, Michigan, John had arrived in Chicago to visit a friend. He found some casual work for a contractor whilst he was there, although there is no proof that this was Gacy. John Prestige was last seen alive when he met his friend for a coffee near Bughouse Square. Circa March to July 1977. Unidentified victim, number 10. Aged between 17 and 21. Estimated height, 5'7" to 5'11". July 5th, 1977. Matthew Bowman, aged 18. Born in Crystal Lake, scant information exists about Matthew Bowman. He had been travelling by train to Harwood Heights to attend a court appearance. His sister reported him missing on the day of his disappearance. September 15th, 1977. Robert Gilroy, aged 18. Robert Gilroy was last seen by his parents when he left home to go to a horse riding lesson. Little did they know, but he hadn't been attending these lessons for some time now. His father was a police sergeant, but still they did not report him missing for a further 12 days after they last saw him, as they were under the impression that he had travelled to Maryland for some sort of special class. September 25th, 1977. John Mowry, aged 19. John had just returned home from Chicago after an 18-month stint with the U.S. Marine Corps. The family had already been struck by tragedy 6 years before, as John's sister Judith had also been murdered in an unrelated case. His parents last saw John on the night of his disappearance as he left home to go out for the night. Circa October 17th, 1977. Russell Nelson, aged either 21 or 22. Russell Nelson would become John Wayne Gacy's first victim killed outside of the Chicago area. He was a student from the University of Minnesota and was already engaged to be married. He had called his mom on October 17th to wish her a happy birthday. Sadly, he would never be heard from again. His mother told investigators that he had travelled to Chicago with another young lad to work as a contractor. November 11th, 1977. Robert Winch, aged 18. A troubled foster child from Kalamazoo, Winch had run away from his foster home after getting in trouble and had ended up in Chicago. He would be identified through evidence of a previous bone injury that had healed, and by a distinctive belt buckle made from a gemstone of tiger eye, found in Gacy's house that he had kept as a macabre memento. November 18th, 1977. Tommy Bowling, aged 20. A married man with a 3-year-old son. According to his sister, Tommy had been using drugs near the time he went missing. He was identified via his dental records and his wedding ring. December 9th, 1977. David Talsma, aged 20. Another U.S. Marine, David Talsma, had told his mom that he was going to a rock concert in Hammond, Indiana. His body was identified through an X-ray of an old healed injury to his left arm. February 6, 1978. William Kindred, age 19. William had met his girlfriend, Mary Jo Paulus, when he picked her and a friend up whilst hitchhiking. They had begun a relationship and he was on his way to visit her at the house, but never arrived. Mary Jo had reported William missing. Investigators managed to piece together his final movements, establishing that Gacy had picked him up on Diversey Drive. In an awful coincidence, Mary Jo actually knew Gacy at the time. June 30th, 1978. Timothy O'Rourke, age 20. Friends of Timothy say that he used to frequent known gay bars, unfortunately the very same gay bars that Gacy was also known to haunt. O'Rourke had also told his roommate that he had been offered a contracting job, and then went out to buy a pack of smokes. He was never seen again. Tim's body was not found at Gacy's house, but in the Illinois River near Dresden Island Lock. Fingerprints, taken from the body, confirm the identity. November 4th, 1978. Frank Landingen, age 19. Frank's final movements were witnessed by his father, who last saw him walking along Foster Avenue. His body was found in the Des Plaines River in Will County by a couple of duck hunters. Some of his personal effects were found in Gacy's house. November 23rd, 1978. James Mazzara, age 20. Hailing from Elmwood Park and preferring to go by the nickname Mojo, James Mazzara was murdered by Gacy, as he confessed, although an exact cause of death could not be established. Mojo was last seen walking in the direction of Bughouse Square just after Thanksgiving dinner. Gacy dumped his body in the Des Plaines River not far from that of Frank Landingen was found. December 11th, 1978. Robert Peast, aged 15. An honor student from Maine West, Robert Peast would prove to be Gacy's last known victim. On the day of his disappearance, he was working a shift at the Nissen Pharmacy in Des Plaines, where he had met Gacy, who had offered him a job at $5 an hour, which was double what he was currently earning, so he eagerly accepted the offer. At around 2100, Peast's mum had arrived to pick him up and take him home. It was her birthday, and she wanted all the family at home to celebrate together. He asked his mum to wait there for him whilst he was just going to talk to a contractor about some work. His mum never saw him again. An hour or so later, he would be dead. Gacy admitted to taking a phone call from a work colleague whilst Peast lay dying a few feet away from him. Whilst searching Gacy's house, a receipt was found for the development of a roll of film belonging to one of Robert's female friends. His body was found dumped in the Des Plaines River. I must also note, on the 21st of March 1978, Gacy abducted 26-year-old Jeffrey Rignall by luring him into his car and then chloroforming him, rendering him unconscious. Gacy then took him back to his house and secured Rignall's limbs with restraints and secured his head into something resembling a pillory. For hours on end, Gacy repeatedly tortured and raped Rignall, whipping him with various objects and pouring melted candle wax onto his body, and then knocking him out with more chloroform, only to repeat the process again when he came round. When Gacy was finally done with him, he dumped the unconscious but still alive body in a quiet spot in Lincoln Park. Once he came to his senses, Rignall managed to get to his girlfriend's house and call the police, but they failed to investigate properly. Rignall and his friends took matters into their own hands, though. They had spotted Gacy's Oldsmobile and followed it back to his house, whereupon the police were called. Gacy was arrested and charged with assault and battery. This charge was still hanging over him at the time of his eventual arrest. Investigation, capture, and psych reports. It would be the murder and discovery of Robert Peast that would finally lead to the downfall of John Wayne Gacy and put an end to his deadly reign of terror. The family filed a missing persons report with the police and reported that Gacy was the contractor that he was last heard talking to at the door. As the last person to see him alive, suspicions instantly fell on Gacy. They asked why Gacy had returned to the pharmacy later that evening just before closing time. He responded that he had received a call from the store owner, Phil Torf, to say that he had left his appointment book there and that he was going back to collect it. However, Torf denied this had happened, and so the Des Plaines PD obtained a search warrant for Gacy's property. When the police first searched Gacy's home, they found several items of a dubious nature, most notably pornographic material, some of which was pedophilic in nature, and bottles of Valium, atropine, and amyl nitrate, commonly known as poppers. They also found a dildo, a blue Parker coat, and several driver's licenses, 36 inches of nylon rope, and many personal trinkets that clearly didn't belong to Gacy. By their nature, aside from the pederasty material, there wasn't a great deal to arrest and charge Gacy over, so the police decided to hold off for now and place him under surveillance. Gacy's affable and disarming public persona style soon led him to becoming quite friendly with those tasked to follow him, even inviting them round for dinner and charming them with the rich, easygoing style. Although he was taking the opportunity to claim that they were harassing him and making a target out of him just because he had a penchant for recreational drug use. He also inferred that he was being harassed because of his political connections too. But Gacy couldn't help himself. He began taking liberties with his followers, deliberately disobeying traffic laws to lose his tails, and once remarking to investigators, "You know, clowns can get away with murder." It was almost as if he was baiting the cops, taunting them, because he was supposedly much cleverer than them. Unfortunately for him, he wasn't smarter, and soon the Popo would be knocking at his door again, armed with a second, much more extensive search warrant. But by now, despite his little games that he was playing with the law, the constant surveillance was beginning to take its toll on Gacy. He had begun drinking very heavily and wasn't sleeping well, and had stopped looking after himself, appearing run down, unshaven and dishevelled. The evidence against Gacy was really beginning to pile up. On the afternoon of December 19th, Gacy invited Detectives Schultz and Robinson into the house. Robinson kept Gacy's attention with conversation, while Schultz discreetly wandered around the house looking for further clues. He noticed that there was an odd smell coming from the heating duct. Anyone who had smelled death before would know and recognize it instantly. I'm told from people in the know that it is never forgotten. The very next day, police interviewed Gacy's former lodgers David Cram and Michael Rossi. Rossi told them at the time that during the summer he had been asked to go into the crawl space and spread 10 very large bags of lime around, and to dig 6 long trenches in very specific locations, which he had done. To make sure that Rossi wasn't an accomplice, he was asked to take a polygraph test, but this gave inconclusive results. David Cram also stated that he had been asked to dig trenches under the house and to spread lime around. He took the opportunity to tell about Gacy's rape attempts as well whilst he was living there. That very same evening, Gacy arrived at his lawyer's office for a meeting. He was clearly suffering from a lack of sleep and heavy drinking. He asked his brief, Sam Amirante, for a drink, and he was presented with a bottle of Canadian whiskey. Whilst he drank, he entered a long, slurred, rambling confession to his crimes, eventually admitting that he had murdered around 30 people, whom he all dismissed as male hookers, liars, and cheats. He was so off his face that he ended up passing out halfway through this confession. When he awoke a few hours later, Amirante told him what he had said, but Gacy denied every word of it and left the office. The 21st of December 1978 would prove Gacy's last day of freedom. By this point he had been reduced to a barely functioning wreck. He drove to Cram and Rossi's new house, where he broke down in tears to the pair, telling them that he had killed at least 30 people. Once he had calmed down and left, Cram and Rossi informed the police what he had said. It was decided that it would be better to arrest Gacy immediately, as they feared he was now at a great risk of self-harm or suicide. That afternoon at 16:30, the second search warrant was granted, and the police wasted no time in gathering a team and heading straight for the house. Gacy had preempted their arrival and disconnected the sump water pump that sat underneath the house. This flooded the crawl space with water, clearly hoping one last desperate throw of the dice might put off the search, but the cops weren't deterred, and they simply reconnected the pump and waited for the groundwater to drain away. After this was done, forensic examiner Daniel Genti was nominated to inspect the crawl space. He had barely scratched the surface of the earth underneath before he revealed a human arm bone with rotting flesh clinging to it. At last, they got him. Whilst he awaited trial, Gacy was held at the Menard Correctional Centre, where he underwent literally hundreds of hours of sessions with forensic psychologists to argue that he would be found not guilty by reason of insanity. Throughout the exhaustive mental assessments, he span the yarn that he had multiple personality disorder, claiming that there were 4 separate, distinct personas: Pogo, the clown, the politician, the contractor, and the one he blamed the crimes on, a cop, whom Gacy referred to as Bad Jack Hanley. saying that Bad Jack had a deep, searing hatred of prostitutes and gay men. But very soon the date of the trial was looming over him, and he would now have to convince a jury that he was indeed crazy as a box of frogs, but that would not be easy as he thought. The day of reckoning was nigh. Trial. The trial of the state of Illinois versus John Wayne Gacy began on the 6th of February 1980 on 33 counts of murder in the first degree and a further charge of sexual assault on a child in relation to the murder of Robert Peast. Judge Louis Garipo presided over the case. When he was called to the stand to enter his plea, his defense team urged him to plead not guilty by reason of insanity. During the opening statements, his defense attorney, Robert Motter, went with this opening gambit. The insanity defense has been looked upon as an escape, the defense of last resort. The defense of insanity is valid, and it is the only defense that we could use here, because that is where the truth lies. Because if my client is normal, then our concept of normality is totally distorted. The defense also produced 3 independent forensic psychologists who had assessed Gacy, all stating that in their professional opinions he was indeed insane, to wit, a paranoid schizophrenic that had multiple personalities. Of course, the prosecution had the uphill task of dismantling this defense and convincing the jury that Gacy was in fact sane all along, and therefore fully in control of his actions. On the 18th of February, the forensic pathologist Robert Stein, who had examined all the bodies recovered from the crawl space under Gacy's house, testified to his findings that 13 of the victims had died via asphyxiation. 1 had multiple stab wounds in the chest, and a further 10 were unable to be determined due to advanced decomposition. Jeffrey Rignall was called to take the stand and relay his awful ordeal at Gacy's hands. Understandably, Rignall was highly traumatized by what happened to him, and many times throughout his testimony he was reduced to floods of tears. This emotional distress led him to even vomiting at one point, at which the judge rightly decided to end the cross-examination and excuse Mr. Rignall from the stand. Donald Voorhees was also called to take the stand, but despite his best attempts he could not bring himself to articulate his experience and was asked to step down. Another man, Robert Donnelly, was also asked to testify, and whilst he managed to do so, he was still visibly highly distressed during his recounting of events. The trial officially ended on the 12th of March, with the closure of the extensive closing arguments of both sides. Before the jury retired, the judge referred to a board that showed the photographs of the victims that were identified by that point, and urged them not to show sympathy, but to show justice. The jury only took 1 hour and 50 minutes to deliberate on their verdict. They found him guilty on all 33 counts of murder in the first degree, and guilty of sexual assault on a minor. However, as per US law, the jury then took a further 2.5 hours to decide on the sentencing. These discussions came back with the decision that John Wayne Gacy should be executed by the state of Illinois. On the inside and execution. Despite the death verdict, Gacy would attempt to stretch the time that he would spend behind bars until his date with destiny. He filed multiple appeals, citing various perceived problems with his trial, including but not limited to disagreeing with his defense's insanity plea, the legality of the initial search of his house, and, rather pathetically, laughably, that 28 of the murders had been committed by employees who had access to his house. He even filed an objection to the method of his execution. Anything that he could think to tie up the legal system and stay his death. Whilst locked up, Gacy became renowned for something much less awful than his crimes. He would churn out many paintings, some of which depicting himself as Pogo the Clown. Whilst these pieces aren't exactly Van Gogh's, they're not exactly terrible. Better than I could do, anyway. Several of his pieces have sold at auctions for many thousands of dollars, although of course, and rightly so, Gacy would not receive any of these funds. During one of the interviews he gave for TV, Gacy claimed that he had zero knowledge of any of his victims. He picked up a file and found a page that showed all of the victims and stared blankly at it. He then said that he had never met them, that they hadn't worked for him, and that he didn't recognize any of their names. When asked about his opinion on other serial killers, most notably Jeffrey Dahmer, he completely rubbished the assertion that they had anything in common, and used the moment instead to rant about how insane people do not deserve to be in a courtroom. On the evening of Tuesday the 10th of May 1994, 14 years after he had been convicted, John Wayne Gacy was taken from his cell and began his final walk, known to many as the Green Mile since the publication of the book and film of the same name. Outside the prison, two groups of the public had gathered, one opposing the death penalty and the other in favour, this latter group even sporting several t-shirts proclaiming, "No tears for the clown." His last words on this earth were a simple insult to the families of his victims. He said, "Kiss my ass." With this formality done with, the button was pressed and the drugs coursed through his body, stopping his heart and ending his pathetic existence. He was pronounced dead by the prison doctor at 17 minutes past 12 in the morning. He was 52 years old. Legacy. And so, the curtain falls on one of the most infamous serial killers of all time. John Wayne Gacy was a predator in every sense of the word. Through a combination of cruising the streets and gay bars and using his standing in the community to gain trust of the young men he had engaged to work for him. Once he lured them in, he then turned into a brutal sadistic murderer, robbing them of their lives and then dumping them in rivers or in shallow graves in his crawl space. His retention of bits of his victims' possessions would prove to be a vital factor in his downfall. I do not believe that Gacy was hearing voices or had multiple personalities. In my opinion, he was fully in control and actively chose to kill. That doesn't mean that he wasn't suffering from psychopathy, but that is not the same thing as multiple personality disorder or paranoid schizophrenia. Psychopaths are still very much the ones in charge, but they simply lack the ability to feel emotions or empathy for their fellow man. They are completely dead inside. Gacy showed that he simply wanted to exercise control over those he encountered. His latent homosexuality most likely caused him to want to hide the uncomfortable fact from the wider community, and therefore he felt compelled to kill those men he convinced into his bed, and those who didn't had to die lest the secret be revealed, or quite possibly simply because they dared to defy his wishes. Despite my personal objections to the death penalty, I am quite glad that this monster has finally gotten his just deserts, but more importantly, I hope that the families of his victims have managed to come to some semblance of closure, and that the victims themselves rest in everlasting love and peace. Thank you for watching this video. I do hope you found it informative and interesting. If you did, please leave it a like and consider subscribing to DID to learn more about other famous serial killers and various events from the darker side of history. Check out my back catalogue to see more great videos just like this one. What do you think of Gacy? Let me know in the comments below. I know a lot of you have been requesting this one for a while, and I finally found the inspiration to write it. I hope I did the story and, more importantly, the victims justice. A note of gratitude to the Chicago Tribune for their piece in covering the victims, which was a huge help in writing the script. If you wish to do so, you can support DID on Patreon or become a channel member to get early access to all of my new videos. Or if you prefer to give a one-off donation, there is the super thanks button for you. Also, don't forget to check out my store on Teespring and have a look through the DID branded swag. I've intentionally cut all the prices right back to make them as affordable as possible. Check out my alternate channel DID Reads to hear more great narration content. And in the meantime, take care of yourselves, and I shall see you on our next descent into darkness.